Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University, Learning About Learning. I'm Ziva Hassenfeld, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. Today's session and our other events help us to serve the mission of the Mandel Center by getting important ideas about Jewish education into the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to learn about other upcoming events. And while we are so delighted to have so many of you joining us live, and we hope that you will ask questions as we go in our Q&A box on Zoom, please also know that today's session is being recorded and we'll make the recording available afterwards on our website via our podcast. Today's guest is my colleague, Professor Miriam Heller Stern, who we are delighted to have with us. Dr. Miriam Heller Stern is director of the School of Education and Associate Professor of Education at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she has also served as Vice Provost for Educational Strategy. She's the founding director of the Creativity Brain Trust, an initiative that engages professional artists in advancing and enhancing creative thinking, teaching, and leadership among educators and learners everywhere. Today, we will be discussing, I have the privilege to discuss with her incredible piece, Jewish Creativity, an Essential Aspiration for Jewish Education. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm grateful to the Mandel Center for supporting me in doing this work and in disseminating it and launching the conversation.
I'm grateful to be able to watch the process and to read the incredible product. So as I was reading or rereading the piece, I couldn't help but keep returning in my own reading to the question of your journey to Jewish creativity. So as we talk, we'll get into the question of what exactly you mean by Jewish creativity and how you so beautifully operationalize that in this piece. But first, I just wanted to go backwards and ask you, how did you get interested in Jewish creativity as a scholar?
So thank you for asking that question. I hope that giving a little bit of autobiography won't be too self-indulgent, but there's a bit of an origin story here. I grew up in a house full of books and a house full of Jewish art and Jewish music. And my father, who was a rabbi, had a study with 3 walls lined with books. Some of those bookshelves were 3 books deep. And these mysterious boxes would always show up from Israel with new books that he would add to the shelf. And my whole idea of Jewish literacy was that the goal was to master what was in those books and find out what was in the books. And when I started my career as a Jewish educator, I went into the field with that idea of Jewish literacy and those books very much in hand and in mind. That being said, as I look back, my home was also filled with Jewish art and Jewish ritual objects. And I will just give a little shout out to my mother, who I know is here watching. And happy birthday, Mom. The house was filled with books and music and art. And we would listen to JM and the AM on the radio, which was the local Jewish radio station in New Jersey, driving to Salvin Checker Day School in the mornings. So that was always surrounding me. And as I eventually grew up, moved to Los Angeles, started a career as an academic here, and was surrounded by people in the entertainment industry and started to connect with Jewish artists, I started to realize that there was this magic in Jewish artists who were teaching. I was a professor and I directed the School of Education at AJU, and I kept having artists and theater makers show up at our master's program saying, well, I want to teach on the side. And I realized it wasn't a side gig for them. It was actually their passion. I started to connect with Jewish artists and collaborate them and co-teach with them. Erin Henney, the director of Theater Gibbik, was one of my original collaborators. Nomi Ackerman, who is a Covenant Award winner and teaches communication skills to incarcerated youth. Isaac Brindigar-Bialik, who is a paper midrash, paper cutter, protest artist. Just one after the other, I discovered these creative people who were doing this magic in their teaching, and I wanted to unlock What is the magic? How are they teaching creativity? And how are people becoming creative in their midst? And also, how could we start to name and identify and clarify what are the pedagogies that they are engaging in that they don't even realize are pedagogy, that they don't even realize that there's learning theory animating what they do. Fast forward, when I got to HUC 8 years ago, I started a new initiative called Beit HaYotzer, the Creativity Brain Trust. And it's inspired by a verse in Jeremiah where God says, if you want to understand prophecy, go to the house of the potter. Watch the potter throw clay over and over again. As that clay gets destroyed and remade, so too can humans remake themselves. And I think that Jewish education is really a process of remaking ourselves and learning to remake our world. That's what artists do intuitively. So I wanted to understand as a scholar, what does it look like to do that remaking? And how do people learn to remake themselves? And how can we engage the enterprise of Jewish education in this work of remaking and renewal and creation?
Wow. I'm glad I asked about the background. That's so interesting. And it sort of frames a lot of what you write about in this piece. And so as we move into the piece, I want to talk about the sources that you bring to build the construct of Jewish creativity. And I want to start specifically with how you connected it and felt inspired by the work of Mordechai Kaplan. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So 20 years ago, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, which was on the tensions between progressive educational impulses and traditional Jewish educational impulses in the early 20th century, I got very interested in the intersecting philosophies of Mordechai Kaplan, John Dewey, Achad Ha'am, and at that time, I wasn't necessarily thinking about the issue of creativity specifically, but I was interested in how Kaplan proposed Jewish education as an important aspect or set of tools for reconstructing society, for creating this idea of a Jewish civilization. And actually, I mean, thinking of origin stories, I have Kaplan's book. This was my grandfather's copy. And this is an architecture for the future of Judaism. And it is 500 pages. It is big. It is heavy. So if you are one of those learners who is looking it up digitally, you will not appreciate just how big and heavy this vision is. And 100 years ago, Kaplan was creating, I think, really a prophetic vision for Jewish life and Jewish education. And at the very end of this book is a chapter on page 480, is a chapter on what Jewish education should look like as an essential part of the architecture of Jewish life. And he names 5 objectives of Jewish education, one of which was creativity. And that just struck me as something worth thinking about that has not been part of the kind of pendulum swinging conversation about should Jewish education be about knowledge or should it be about experience? Should it be about wisdom or should it be about belonging? We vacillate in Jewish education between these two things. And that's actually the topic of my colleague Tali Zelkowitz's thought piece. She was my chevruta in this process. And I know people will be tuning in a couple of months to hear her talk about that. Kaplan was clear that if we didn't learn how to be creative and make Jewish culture, aesthetics, appreciation of beauty, and discernment part of the Jewish educational process, we would not succeed in building Jewish education. He offered a definition of Jewish creativity that I think is incredibly profound and instrumental for today, and it is really the underlying inspiration for my whole idea about chidushim, which we're going to talk about in a minute. He defined creativity as the result of a whole-souled organic reaction to life's values, and a reaction in which senses, emotions, imagination, intelligence, and will are fully aroused. That to me is such a deep definition because it already signals before we were hooking learners up to fMRI machines to understand what the brain is doing in the last decade of neuroscience research. Kaplan understood that the spiritual, the intellectual, and the emotional were all intertwined, and that creativity represents the process of being that fully human spiritual person who feels both intellectually engaged, emotionally engaged, and imaginatively engaged all at the same time. So for me, this idea of creativity as an aspiration for Jewish education is based on that vision of being a Jewish human and being engaged in all of those aspects of ourselves.
And when, what mediums did Mordecai Kaplan imagine creativity be expressed in, and where have you pushed that a little in your own thinking about Jewish creativity?
So I think he wanted to see real growth in Jewish arts and culture. And he did not really tease out how that creativity piece would instrumentalize in Jewish educational contexts. And so that really became a jumping off point for me, even a call to action to try to figure out, okay, so it's 100 years later, and now we have all of this learning theory, and we have, the way you study sense making of texts and the way we think about teachers and pedagogy and learners in classrooms and meaning making. It seemed to me that there were all these connections to be made. And as I said before, as I started to watch artists do their quote magic and sit with them and reflect with them about, okay, so Alicia Joe Ravens, you have created this song about the prophet Miriam, and you see her experience through a whole different light because you connect to her as a woman and you're imagining her psyche. What should we be thinking about, right? How does your song become an invitation to all of us to imagine ourselves as Miriam in a different way beyond what's written in the text? Because I understand the text as an invitation to be in relationship with the text, with those characters. I think we're supposed to imagine who they could have been and what they could have been like. So the artists see things that not everyone necessarily sees just by looking at the text on its face. They introduce us to those possibilities. And so they operate the place where imagination and intellect meet.
So interesting. And so for you, sort of some flexibility of medium in expression is
Absolutely.
essential.
It's about becoming multilingual.
Yeah.
I think our education system tends to push us into becoming fluent in a very specific set of Jewish languages. Part of that is just a matter of time. We don't have a lot of time to get fluent in anything in Jewish education. And so we try to focus on what we think are the most important ones. But engaging with the arts, learning through the arts, can help us access things in our own understanding that go far beyond mere language sometimes. Ariel Berger taught me this beautiful idea from Elie Wiesel, which is when you run out of words, sing a nigun, right? And I love that because there are these moments, I think about this week in particular, where our country is absorbing an election that has lots of emotions and feelings and hopes that are just in a kind of chaotic mess right now. And there's a lot of analysis. There are a lot of people telling us what we should think and how we should feel and how we should cope and what we should hope for. And sometimes you just need to sit back and sing a nigun and get grounded and try to find understanding through a different medium than someone telling you what to think or how to think. And that's what the creative
Yeah.
process engages us in doing. Adina Allen, creator of Jewish Studio Project, has this lovely method where she says, have you made art about it yet? And right, sometimes it just, you need to make something so that you can make sense.
Yes, I'm with you. I was talking to my student today who's much younger than me. I said, it just all felt right when we were listening to Beyonce together yesterday as Kamala Harris walked out. And he said, why? I was like, oh, okay, so we're not fluent in the same languages. But there's a woman of my generation that there was an expression there that no words would capture. Um, And so thinking about both the relevance of this idea of Jewish creativity and also making sure that your audience and your readers understand what you mean and don't sort of misuse the term. Tell me about how it relates to sense making, which we already sort of discussed a little, problem solving, and even moral thinking. How does
Mhm.
it, if an educator is sort of trying to create a constellation of goals and purposes in their work, where does Jewish creativity fit in with those other goals?
Right. So here's where we talked about Kaplan as a jumping off point. And my definition of creativity is that it is the process through which we ideate and develop chidushim. The idea of chidushim is an old Jewish idea about coming up with new interpretations and new ideas in the Beit Midrash. And I would expand that definition of chidushim in the way that Ken Robinson talks about creativity as the having of new and original ideas that are of value, right? You can have lots of off the wall ideas, and that's a lot of fun, but do those ideas have purpose? Do they have animating use in the world? So I understand creativity as the process of developing those chidushim, and we can use all different materials and resources and languages to create them. I think that Jewish creativity is compelling and useful as a term because it actually captures a whole bucket of aspirations of Jewish education in one breath. Um, we're not just advocating for chidushim for the sake of having ideas, although, nothing against the having of wonderful ideas, but I imagine it as having a sense of purpose, right? It's that whole-souled organic reaction to life through the senses, through the intellect, through the imagination, as Kaplan said. But chidushim, especially in the moment we're living in today, in history, right? And I think everyone can agree that we are living through a watershed moment in Jewish history that we have been navigating through for a year, and it continues to evolve. In a moment like this, chidushim require a certain kind of optimism. We have to believe that it's possible and worthwhile to come up with new ideas, right? That is about not giving up hope. That is about an essential kind of Jewish tikva that does not get lost, even when life feels complicated, threatening, overwhelming, right? It's the hope that it's worth trying again and again to come up with better ideas and not giving up on what's possible. For me, that's the core of resilience, right? That's the flexibility, the bouncing back, the finding the strength through ideas, through our human capacities to do better. So for me, creativity really captures that. And it's the process of weeding through the mess of the tohu vavohu, of the chaos. So when we talk about moral reasoning or sense making or finding purpose and meaning in Jewish education, creativity, when we think about the framework of these different habits that I've laid out, it's about finding the right partners to collaborate, to come up with new ideas, the commitment to look for new interpretations when we feel like we just don't have the answer yet. And it's the ability to start to make sense of the tohu vavohu around us. And so despite all the progress in humanity, despite the fact that we have recreated the world again and again, humanity continues to build Towers of Babel, continues to create tohu vavohu, to create chaos. And so we have to keep ordering it. We have to keep at it. And I think the educational process is something that starts engaging humans in that process even while they're young. It's not something we're preparing students for later in life. So I think of creativity actually as a process of the ideating and the refining and the assessing and the crafting and the collaborating. It's intellectual work, it's practical work, it's purposeful work, it's work. That's why we create for 6 days and then we have Shabbat and we have to decompress because Creativity isn't just about having fun or having an art project or not having to learn today. It's work. And after 6 days, you need rest. You need to restart. And we need to roll up our sleeves and do it again. That's the world we're living in now. So I'm looking for something deeper and another way of getting at an ultimate aspiration for Jewish life that goes beyond what do we know and how many blessings can we recite and can we go through the motions.
Yeah, it's so clear and bold and inspiring, this idea that like create create new ideas. Not don't prepare to create new ideas. Like that's part of the process. And as you were as in this piece, you're laying out your framework of the four facets with interpreting and curating and making and collaborating. You have this really thought-provoking line where you say it allows you to be in charge of your own Jewish journey. And I would love for you to sort of elaborate on what you mean by that.
One of the things I'm noticing in this world of curation through social media, I don't think it's just because I live in Hollywood, so to speak, but I think the world is now governed by influencers who are telling stories and creating realities that are based on perception. And if we've got this, decades long history of Jewish education being about Jewish identity or the Jewish journey or Jewish community. We have a lot of different ways that we describe what is it we're trying to do. I think this moment demands that Jews learn how to tell their own story. And that requires a kind of creativity. We need to learn how to be storytellers. We need to learn how to understand ourselves and then learn how to communicate who we are as individuals, what we stand for as individuals and also as a collective. And that might change over one's life. And I watch my own children who are, almost 11, almost 16, 19. They're changing by the minute, even though at their core, they are who they are, right? And they're learning to communicate. They're learning to tell themselves who they are and tell others who they are. I think the creative process helps us understand and discover new things about ourselves. And we're in danger of being told who we are as opposed to being able to own that ourselves.
Wow,
So
yeah.
I would like the Jewish educational process to engage Jews in learning to tell that story, but not just a made up story, but we have so much wisdom that we can draw upon, right? How is my story like the story of Abraham being bold, or Sarah in being particularly bold, saying, what? We're going where? Am I on this journey with you? What does that partnership look like? How do I see myself in the stories of Jewish history, and how will I use them to create the Jewish future?
I love that. Yeah, and being willing to not be forced to choose a box of other
Exactly.
people's stories. So as I was reading it, I was thinking about, I asked my kids if they were Jewishly creative, and they had no idea what I was talking about. And it led me to wonder, how important is it to you that learners, particularly young learners, are able to name when they're participating in creative learning, are able to name Jewish creativity?
So look, scholars name things so that they can study them, right? So that they can draw a fence around what is it that I'm looking at, and then try to understand it better. So I've offered a definition of creativity so that we can have a conversation about a set of aspirations that I believe hold together as a vision for Jewish education and a vision for what's possible. I think there are people who feel resistant to the word creativity because they think they're not creative. They think that creativity is, when you ask people, who do you think were the 5 most creative people in history? Often they will name artists and leaders who are men. They may not even identify themselves as, even possibly able to do that, right? So in my piece, I really try to systematically break down those myths about who can be creative and what is creative. Nevertheless, I'm realistic about the fact that there will be people who still say, well, I don't know if that's creativity. And my answer is, okay,
Mm.
call it something else. Use 10 words to describe it instead of one. That's fine. Look, I can't claim to be an expert in marketing and, not trying to create a new buzzword here. What I'm trying to do is animate people to do the work. So for me, that's really all that matters. Like, we name things so we can study them. So for example, let's look at the example of multiple intelligences in education. People have gotten very caught up in multiple intelligences. Are those categories real? Are they the right categories? Should we use them as labels? Should we not use them as labels? And then there becomes this whole academic argument over whether is the term the right term? Has it been misused? Are we mislabeling kids? Should we talk it? But the fact is, we do know that there are lots of different ways that people learn. And that was actually a very useful conceptual framework for us to begin that conversation and try to address different needs of different learners and help them develop their potential in lots of different ways. So do I care if someone says, creativity, it doesn't speak to me? I have trouble with that. What I'd like them to do is actually try to sing a new song with me, try to learn this language, open themselves up, because they may be surprised to find that, in fact, they are creative.
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly there is that reticence to the term, like almost like intelligence at some point, where it was like, I don't know, creativity is something you're either born with or you're not. How could I possibly develop it? And I think that reading this, there really is tremendous value to having this framework, if not on the part of the learners, certainly on the part of the educators. And I want to sort of circle back to your journey at the beginning to this question and ask, as you were developing this in conversation with the artists who inspired this work, with the artist educators, how did they help you refine these categories? How did they push your own thinking and challenge you?
So it's been a really wonderful, reflexive process with the artists over the years, particularly the Beta Yotzer artists, Ariel Berger, Alicia Jo Rebens, John Adam Ross, Aaron Henney, because I've had multiple opportunities to observe them teach and then reflect together. What happened? What did you do? Why did you make that move? Oh, that's what we call it in pedagogical terms. Oh, really? I didn't know I was doing that. Often we would co-plan together before a session. And so we'd be able to add in some kind of educational structures or pedagogical structures, if you will. One of the things that surprised me was just seeing how much of artists' work is actually planned and designed. And we think it's magic. We think it's just, oh, they're a genius in a way that we can't be. And I've noticed that I've actually started to incorporate a lot of their pedagogical moves into my own teaching over the years just by watching them. And I think it's really possible for educators to become creatives in their own right by studying these pedagogies and learning them. And so my next project is to actually write in-depth chapters describing each of these artists' pedagogies so that we can really get to know them better. And I know that the artists feel really fulfilled just in their own professional growth, expanding this side of themselves as teachers with a real sense of purpose and feedback.
Great. And I know we're running out of time, which is really unfortunate, but always the feeling in learning about learning. But could you end with one example of how this work has impacted your own classroom pedagogy?
Absolutely. So, dare I say, I've created my own creative pedagogy over the years
Are you
using
singing a lot more?
mostly by myself, not so much in public. But I have developed teaching around a Japanese art form called kintsugi, where we take a bowl, we smash it, we bring the pieces back together in some way and paint the cracks with gold. And I've created a whole Beit Midrash around it. And what we do with it is really reflect on how we hold brokenness, how we face imperfection, and how we take something that is in pieces and put it back together in a new way, and how we become creators ourselves. And that for me has been just really mind opening to be able to do this exercise over and over again with educators over the years here at HUC, because the things that people discover about themselves when they're actually engaged in a physical learning activity and a metaphor, learning through metaphor for me is the pedagogy that has opened up new worlds, because people just find insights that they never would have found on the page.
Yeah. And I'll never forget hearing you present on that pedagogy at some conference.
Right. It was at the
Miriam, thank you
conference.
so much for bringing for having the confidence in yourself sort of to bring the notion of creativity to us, particularly in academia, who hide behind our citations and our words and pushing us, and of course to the most important audience, which is the Jewish educators. I'm so grateful to have this piece in my library, and I hope to return to it and learn from it every time I start a new course. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it has. And I hope that everyone will join us when we continue our Learning About Learning series with our next fabulous speaker in January. More details will be in the chat. Thank you all so much.